ploughing then continued, and the green fields turned to brown, and by 3:30 it was finished for the day. They'd ploughed 11 fields successfully. However, the kink in the tail of this story is that nothing would be planted on those ploughed fields. The farmers would be too scared, as happened in the past, that the settlers would come down and uproot the crop, probably an olive tree saplings which had been planted there. That wasn't just an imagined fear, that is what had happened before, and indeed on 2 other occasions we saw where exactly that had happened, where settlers had come down and uprooted the crops. At this location too, the farmers showed us the trunks of mature 12-year-old olive trees where settlers had drilled into the trunk of the olive and poisoned it, and it had withered. So they didn't dare plant in these ploughed fields. Why then plough at all? Because Israel has a law which allows it to confiscate land, any fields which are not cultivated at all. And by ploughing the fields, the Palestinian farmers keep that historic claim to their own land, hoping, praying that peace will come one day. Otherwise, if they stop doing that, Israel could claim the fields as state property.
Hello everyone. The clip you've just heard is from a presentation given by Phil Craine, who's the guest on today's podcast. I recorded the presentation several years ago after Phil had returned from working doing peace monitoring in the West Bank and was giving a whole series of these talks on the injustices he'd witnessed there. At the time, I was really struck by Phil's ability to maintain a calm and peaceful demeanour, both in the situations out in the Middle East themselves and also upon receiving hostile comments from crowds who, whilst they hadn't been there and seen what he'd seen, had very, very strong opinions on the rights and wrongs of the situation. So that always stuck with me, and I wanted to interview Phil and go beneath the narrative and really explore what it was like for him on the inside, on a mental and emotional, spiritual level, to engage with them hostility, both here and there. So that's what we get into in this interview. However, I asked Phil to start off by recalling a really pivotal and influential moment in his earlier life when he was working as an accountant in Africa.
I think when I was back in my early 20s, I worked for a firm of accountants, and they sent me for a few weeks to Khartoum, the Sudanese capital, my first time outside Europe, and all of a sudden I was assaulted with my senses, different smells in the souk, very different language to anything I'd been used to. But we were insulated from a lot of that because we stayed at the Hilton Hotel in Khartoum, a very luxurious, comfortable place near the confluence of the blue and the white Niles coming together. And we stayed at this wonderful hotel, and I can remember having a kind of an epiphany out there, totally unexpected. And I was looking out one day from my balcony in the 8th floor of the Hilton in Khartoum, and I could look down into the hotel grounds, and I could see the trappings of any international hotel. I suppose I could see the pool with the lounges. I could see the tennis courts on grass, watered, sprinklers, and I suppose all this was the trappings of a Western luxurious lifestyle, including me. I was on the inside, but from my vantage point, I could see beyond the square perimeter of the hotel complex, and I could see the Nile shimmering away in the distance. But I could also see just immediately outside the hotel wall, which was maybe 3 or 4 meters high, barbed wire and shards of glass on the top, quite an ugly thing. But I could see just beyond this a movement which caught my eye, and it was, when I looked closer, It was a goat herd, a guy who was surrounded by a small flock of goats, and the goats were trying to paw their way up the bit of forage. It was semi-scrub, almost desert-like conditions, but a few acacia trees were growing there. I can see it clearly now. And the goats were trying to get a bit of forage from the lower branches of these trees. And the guy himself was sitting under one of these acacia bushes in a cardboard box and seeking to eke out an existence, sheltering from the afternoon sun. And he was about 10 meters away from one of the guys who was playing tennis on a watered court. I could see them both from my point of view. They couldn't see each other. And I never took a photograph of this, but the photo remains in here, and it struck me just the polarization of those two opposites within one field of vision. And I remember thinking quite clearly, this is not a good way to run a planet with such discrepancies of wealth and poverty. Almost cheek by jowl in this instance, but you rarely see them so close together and in one frame. And that was my first trip outside Europe, and I felt after this something is not right, and that was certainly had a formative experience. And you know, when I follow my journey, my timeline on from that, I think probably a couple of years later, I left that firm of accountants, and I went overseas to do voluntary service overseas in Pakistan for a couple of years. But that particular moment in time, you know, and I'm sure there was a background that made that come forward, but it had a profound effect on me.
I mean, the obvious comparison that comes up for me is the story of the Buddha, right? Who is literally, he's in a palace, and he's been kept in the palace his whole life, never seen the outside world. His father, the king, is insulated from it, and then he sneaks outside and he sees poverty, sickness and death, right? And realize, oh, the world is not the way I have always believed it was. And I think it's an experience Europeans have sometimes, where Europe is a kind of palace, parts of it, and then we go outside when we're in our early 20s, and although we've seen it on TV, to be confronted by it, and the world's never the same again.
Yes.
So did you have an underlying spiritual influence going on? Because I know you have been very involved in the Christian church in various ways. I believe you would identify as a Christian. Would that be correct? Was that there then, or is that something that came in later?
I would and do identify as a Christian. I follow the teachings of Jesus. I try to, and I accept some of the beliefs, and I will do my best on a day-to-day basis as a model for my life. Again, when you look at the timeline, it sometimes seems like 3 steps forward and 2 steps backwards, or even 3 steps backwards. But it's been a journey that I've tried to commit to. There's been times of backsliding, which spiritually I feel I've gone backwards. But yeah, more or less I've always come back, because I do believe that my God is a God of second chances and third chances and 33rd chances, who will never let me go. And I think my favourite passage from the Bible is the prodigal son, the return of the prodigal, particularly where the father sees the son returning from his wayward journey and rushes to him and welcomes him back, and that speaks powerfully to me.
And has that always been something that's present in your life, right back when you were out in Africa, or did you become more involved in Christianity as an adult?
Yes, certainly. I've tried different types of church, but it was always to see, in different localities. I've spent time moving around, and in different countries, and indeed in different cities within the British Isles. and I've always this sort of brand of Christianity, if you like, has varied over the years. But I've always made that commitment, to try to follow in the footsteps of Jesus.
Okay, so the plan is to talk about this particular trip to the Middle East. But fill us in on the midsection, because you were starting to say about going to Pakistan there. So what did the in-between part look like of your life as a 20-something-year-old man to modern times?
I think, well, I'll explain that was one reason for the epiphany, as I call it. That was one reason why that brought home to me the great inequalities in wealth and in power within the world, and that made me feel, well, I can't change everything, but I can do what I can. And so that led me to, after I qualified, to volunteer, to go to Pakistan as an accountant. But of course, when you're there, you do 101 other things. The accountancy took a back seat, and I was involved in teaching English. I was a hostel warden. I was an ambulance driver, a vegetable shopper, and that gave me a much broader view of the country as a whole. And the one thing I witnessed there was the hospitality that was given to me by rich and poor, Muslim and Christian alike. The welcome they show as a stranger, and I think that was something as well that had a formative influence on me. To the extent that we in the West have largely lost the art of hospitality compared to out there. So that too had an effect, I think.
I'll just cut in there, because it really struck me. I went to Egypt when I was 20, and two things struck me. One, how much of an unconscious kind of image we take on of the Arab world without consciously thinking about it. There's this negative drip feed that comes through the media, and being there, immersed in this culture, which I'm sure there's good and bad there. I'm sure they have problems like we do, but it's very different in terms of the level of interaction on the streets, the concepts of hospitality, engagement with strangers, and it felt shocking to fly back into London, where that's greatly diminished then. So that's another experience that comes through from going to these places.
And we in the West have so degraded not just hospitality but relationship, and we've just got a huge atomization of society now. Clubs and societies are almost a thing of the past for many people, and that's a real challenge, but that's probably another podcast. So I went to Pakistan. I came back, and I wanted to enter the world of development, global development. So after another few years of knocking around, I joined up with Christian Aid. They were looking for an accountant, and I joined them in London in their headquarters. After another few years, I left their finance department and went to had a sideways movement to their Horn of Africa desk, which allowed me to go out regularly for extended trips to Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Kenya, a very poor region, and one moreover that's been affected by conflict. And this was the 1990s and the noughties, when there were civil war in Sudan. It was ongoing. There was the Ethiopian-Eritrean war. There was just the ongoing lack of a central government in Somalia since 1990. All of these were quite challenging and eye-openers to me. Even though I wasn't living there, I was just doing extended trips from the UK. So as well, that had an effect on me. And I think Christian Aid too was a great organisation to work for, and still is. I was 23 years there altogether, and I think it taught me the value of speaking out against forms of injustice when I see it. So most of Christian Aid's work is done at the coalface through partners doing health or education or water work, for example. But they reserve a little of their income for campaigning, to try to to change attitudes and government policies in the West towards that, because they think that's one way they can get lasting change. So advocacy, lobbying, campaigning are very much part of Christian Aid's approach. And my latter years of Christian Aid were spent back here on the island, where I was born and raised. And so it was like coming home. And so the challenge there was to bring some of those wider world concerns back to a Manx audience, and to try to challenge that audience to sometimes raise their sights above the horizon sometimes. And I think simply being an island sometimes gives us a very insular, inward-looking attitude amongst some people, and that was to try to raise awareness of the wider world and global perspectives.
So that's a very interesting theme, about that you go out to these places, you see a totally different world, and then you come back and have to communicate with people who haven't seen it. Okay, and it's something I'd like to explore. But I think maybe we'll finish the narrative first and then go into that. So ultimately, around 4 or 5 years ago, you went off into Israel, Palestine, as there's a special name for it. It's an ecumenical, I'll let you say the special name, but it's a
mouthful.
Yes, it's a peace observer, right? Where you would oversee what was going on there. I think the aim is that if there's an international observer there, then it's less likely people are more considerate of what they might do and not do with regard to violence and aggravation, and well, yeah, for those obvious reasons. So I know that the Middle East is a place that is special to Christians, perhaps for good and bad reasons. Okay, was there anything that drew you there particularly? What formed the decision to go?
Okay, well, the decision to go was very much, when I think about it now, a kind of another epiphany moment in a way. I was still at Christian Aid here, but I took a few weeks off the payroll, to walk the Camino in northern Spain with a friend, and I didn't expect anything radical to come, but along this medieval pilgrimage route, after a few days, I found myself dropping down through the gears emotionally, and just walking through nature day after day made me sort of step back and see the wood for the trees without really trying. And I could see that I was more open to nature, to the looking at the time instead of looking at my watch, or looking at the sun in the sky, looking at the length of the shadow. I was more interested in the flora and the fauna that we were passing, and as I say, just gradually getting into this sort of lifestyle, just staying in hostels each night as we ploughed on westwards. And it came to me quite suddenly that I could not go back to the status quo ante in my life, which I came to see on the Camino was far too busy. I was juggling too many balls in the air, and that something had to give. And moreover, it was my paid work at Christian Aid that needed to go, to create more space. And at the same time, I had been actually finding out more about this program you mentioned, which is run by the Quakers in Britain and Ireland, but under the World Council of Churches, and it's about human rights monitoring, as you say, in the Israel and the West Bank. And basically, you go out as a human rights monitor for 3 months. You stay in a different location, in an ordinary house, 7 houses throughout the West Bank, and I was interested in this. Indeed, it was a Christian Aid partner. The Quakers, as you know, have always been historically interested in issues of peace and justice, And I'd find out more, and I'd put out feelers to explore whether this would be right for me, and the Camino confirmed that it would, and that it was only for 3 months, but it was a paid post for 3 months. And so I decided that on the Camino that when I get back home I would resign and would go out in this. It felt right. It jumped up off the screen for me when I first saw this program, and I would say that was God's spirit meeting mine. You know, it was exciting and it was scary, and those are often two indications that this might be from God in my experience. And so first day back, I forced myself to ring my boss and hand in my notice. I knew that if I didn't do it on the first day, I wouldn't have the bottle to do it at all. And so at Christmas 2013, I finally stepped down from Christian Aid after 23 years. And in January, I went out to Jerusalem, and I was posted in East Jerusalem for 3 months. Doing this human rights work, and when we unpack that, what does that mean? To some extent, it means a protective presence, whereby individuals who wear the vest of this recognized organization, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine and Israel, EAPPI for short, and by having independent, neutral observers in places where Israelis and Palestinians are cheek by jowl, and particularly potential flashpoints, like military checkpoint, or like where Palestinian farmers are trying to plough their fields and under the gaze of Israeli settlers on the West Bank. Places like that, we are posted or invited to be a presence there in order to deter violence from kicking off. It's very hard to prove that you've deterred something, but experience has shown, the program's been there 15 years now, that you know, we know if we're being watched, we might behave a bit better. And so by having us there as an international presence, the hope would be that violence would not kick off in such tense circumstances. And so that's what we did. It was about advocacy too. I don't hold any brief for either Israelis or Palestinians. I did work on a kibbutz when I was in my early 20s. But I have seen, you know, and come to understand a more fuller situation there now, where Israel conquered the West Bank in 1967 in the Six-Day War and is still occupying it. And you now have 500,000 Israeli settlers living very uneasily amongst 3 million Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And so that situation, it's going on, and it's a desperate one. And so although I don't have any natural bias towards Israel or Palestine, the situation in which I found myself was one in which clearly one of those parties had all the power, all the control, all the wealth, and kept the other one under its thumb. And so we were looking out for human rights violations on either side. But the situation is that most of them are, whether it's a house demolition or uprooting of olive tree saplings, where the Palestinians were oppressed.
Okay, well, let's use that as a jumping off point for some of the more interesting questions, maybe, because I re-watched the presentation last night because just for the audience, I recorded Phil doing this presentation a few years ago, and I'll link to it on YouTube below. And I say YouTube particularly because it's worth watching, because there are photographs throughout it which really bring it to life. And within the first couple of minutes, you're talking about the house demolition you went to, which I think happened quite early on in your time there. Now let's see if I get the narrative right. The Israelis had come along with bulldozers and demolished this man's house. His son was there, and he'd had tear gas used on him. And the crime was building a house without a permit, but Israel severely restricts permits for Palestinians, so they can't move. They build illegally, and then the Israeli bulldozers come along. And I think the Palestinians are actually sent a bill for this, right? It was, I'm going to say £10,000.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
50,000 shekels.
Yeah.
10,000
Right.
pounds. Yeah, you've got a good memory.
So now, I watched it last night. So within 2 minutes, okay, of watching this, I can feel rage within me and thinking, like, if the Isle of Man was occupied by a foreign power, any foreign power, where they were Indians, Australians, Jews, Muslims, whatever, and half the country was gone, and I built a conservatory and they sent bulldozers along and so on, right? Or they to knock my house down, you're given however long to grab whatever you can and get out, and then you're homeless. I mean, my response to that would be one of, violence comes to mind, right? That one has a right to defend oneself and ultimately to pick up a gun, right? And I don't think that's a radical response by any means for normal human standards of behavior, that when our territory is invaded, we respond back, okay? And that's what, there's a doctrine of defensive warfare across the world. So I'm just observing that, as that's my instant reaction, is one of, like, it enrages me. And I wonder, when you're there in that situation, what did it bring up for you, feelings-wise, to be stuck in?
I would say that we were very well trained before we went by the Quakers. As I say, they've got a strong stream of pacifism running through their veins. And we were trained that we were there primarily to witness and to record. And our weapons would be camera in one pocket and the notebook in the other. We were there to witness, and we were there to write it up and to send it out on the internet to reports, both back to IAPI in London, Geneva, and also on our own blogs and newsletters. And they almost think that this advocacy value is more important than what we're doing there at the time, than the program itself. So we are trained to be dispassionate observers. Now, of course, we have feelings, and you could see that, as I said, one side has all the power in this and the other doesn't. But it doesn't do anybody any good. In fact, I would argue it's counterproductive if you show yourself as to be on one side,
Sure.
and you had to stay neutral and to say, okay, I would feel exactly the same feelings if the boot was on the other foot and it was Palestinians who were oppressing Israelis. You have to be,
well, absolutely,
and indeed, we visited Sderot, where the Israeli Jewish population has had to put up with incoming Hamas missiles for 10 years from the Gaza Strip, and those are just as much violations of human rights as when the boot's on the other foot.
So was that, you say you were trained, but was it a conflict within you? Was there a case of a deep breath here?
Well, we were trained, but perhaps at a more deeper level as well. I'm not a person who's comfortable with conflict. I do try to follow the teachings of Jesus. As I said, an important one for me is turning the other cheek. So when someone steals your coat, offer him another one. When someone strikes your cheek, turn the other cheek. And yeah, you're right, that goes against the grain of the human instinct is to fight back and to engage and to but I think, and that's not to say that injustice at all should be tolerated, but the ways of dealing with it were to record, to photograph, to monitor, and to witness, and to tell the world what's going on. So, for example, if we had in the training, we had by the Quakers, it was role play, which I dread, but this was it, and we were playing the part of ourselves, ecumenical accompaniers, and we were there accompanying the Palestinian farmers, and the settlers come down with guns and start firing and say, get off the land. And we had to decide what to do, and of course we jumped in with our our Westerners hat on to try to solve the problem. We would engage with the Israelis, try to persuade them that this really isn't the decent thing to do, and they should go and leave the Palestinians alone. And that was the wrong answer. The Palestinians have had to deal with this, we were told, year in, year out. The correct answer was to withdraw, to go up the valley sides, and to take notes, to photograph, to film, and to record dispassionately what was going on, factually what was going on, to record as near as we could a truthful account of the incident, and to send that out, and to tell as much of the world as we can what was going on.
Okay, thank you for that. A couple of follow-ups, okay. So the first one being, looking at the photo of the two men sat there by their demolished house, okay, in the rubble. And also you've mentioned about the olive trees. So the other big thing you talk about in the presentation is the Palestinians going off to farm their land. They find the settlers put roadblocks in the way. They have to go around them. They plough the land, and then they can't actually plant anything in it because the settlers will destroy it. But they have to plough the land, or the Israeli government will consider it abandoned land and take it off them, right? So two incredible incidents of injustice. What sense did you get from the Palestinians? I've always wondered, looking at the photo, particularly of those two men on their house, was there a sense of apathy? Was there a sense of anger from them? And particularly also because you talk about a Christian influence going on here and turn the other cheek, okay? Now there are Palestinian Christians, of course, but it's predominantly Muslim. So I wonder, how did you feel they dealt with the kind of situations they were subjected to?
I think in that instance, seeing the father and son whose house had just been demolished that dawn, this was a couple of hours later, still very fresh for them. The son and his friends had been tear gassed by the Israeli forces, and I wanted to get the story, so through an interpreter, Arabic interpreter, I managed to sit down with them and to get the story. They had an air of weary resignation. This had happened to them before. This had happened to so many of their friends and neighbours. They'd had this demolition order hanging over them for some time, sometimes years, where they have been forced to build without planning permission because the Israelis won't give that planning permission because they're trying to get the Jewish majority within Greater Jerusalem. And on their part, the Palestinians, I didn't pick up anger. I picked up weary resignation and powerlessness. And did that make me angry? No, to be honest. But it did make me determined to tell their story in as powerful way as I could.
So my other question, and it might be obvious what's coming, is I'm wondering what sense you got from Israelis involved in these kind of situations. I'm not talking about the Israelis who are out there peace protesting, okay? I mean the ones that are carrying out demolition orders, the settlers coming down from the hills. And what particularly influences this question for me actually is, like, I've just recently been on a trauma workshop, okay, where we did these kind of role play games of victim and victimizer. So a person could sense what it was like to have someone shouting in their face, okay, or to insist that they change their mind about something, okay. And on simple things like you would tell me your favorite color, and I would say, no, Phil, it's not blue, it's red, and you've got to say it's red. And I'd try different ways to persuade you. Oh, come on now, it's red. And then I get really angry, And in playing the victimizer, that was a unique thing for me because I don't go around through life trying to be a bully, okay. And I tried two different hats on with it, okay. I tried the hat of thinking I'm a nasty bully now, and I'm going to try and bully Phil out of his favorite color. And the other hat I tried on was, hey, I'm the good guy here. Like, Phil's got this wrong idea in his head that his favorite color is red, and I've got to help him by convincing him it's blue.
And I found I could do it much more powerfully when I perceive myself as being good and virtuous, and you've got this wrong-headed idea, and I'm here to help you, and I might need to use strong arm tactics to do that, right? And I wonder, I'm just going to put all that on the table and leave you freely to answer. What did you feel from the Israelis? Because, in a sense, we could sit here in this kitchen now and think, well, don't they get it? Don't they get that demolishing people's houses is wrong? That how can they go down and feel in any way like good human beings when they're smashing up people's farmland and crops and putting roadblocks in the way? Did you gain any insight into that?
To some extent, yes. We didn't talk to the army or police when they were demolishing houses. We didn't talk to the settlers who tore up the olive tree saplings, because that was the dead of night. But we did talk to some Israelis across the spectrum nonetheless. And we made a point of visiting an Israeli settlement in the West Bank, near Bethlehem, actually, from. And we were invited inside the home of an Israeli settler, very comfortable home. And he spoke to us about his justification and for what was going on. And he was not a religious Jew. He was a Jew who had been formerly a Wisconsin dairy farmer, had emigrated to Israel, and he moved into the West Bank deliberately because he sees it part of their national project. He would like to see a greater Israel, not for religious reasons, as some of the Orthodox would, but for nationalist reasons.
Well, that is an interesting point about Israel. I think people think it's a very religious conflict. Zionism has been very secular throughout its history, actually.
Yes.
And some religious Jews have strongly supported it. Some of the strongest opposition has come from religious Jews to political Zionism. So it's an interesting point.
Yes,
but
and
please carry on.
I mean, the Orthodox are very ambiguous. Some of them will not recognise the modern 1948 creation of the state of Israel, because they are waiting for the second coming, or the first coming, as they would say. But this guy was a Zionist. He was a secular Jew who wanted to see a greater Israel, and from his point of view, a more secure Israel with more secure borders. And so we listened to this guy, and of course, you wanted to come in with at different points in his argument, but yes, but what about the other side? And yes, but, and it was a good learning time for us, because we really needed to just listen, and to bite our tongues to some extent, because there was value in listening to that. Another example was I went alone one afternoon from East Jerusalem, where we were living, to West Jerusalem. There's no border set up there. You can cross freely these days. And I went to visit the Yad Vashem, the Israel's national museum / memorial to the Holocaust. And I wanted to go alone and to experience it more fully, really. And I could see that the first gallery I went into was how the Jews over the centuries, long before Hitler, had been oppressed and persecuted by Christendom in particular. I didn't know there were riots in York in 1190 against the Jews, that England and Spain had expelled them all for centuries in medieval times, and the more recent, the 18th century pogroms in Poland and Russia, and a deeper understanding of what Jews had gone through. And you could understand then their overwhelming desire after the Second World War, particularly, to have a safe, secure homeland. And that itself was help me get a broader picture of what's going on in this very intractable conflict.
And I think that it sends Jewish people one of two ways sometimes, in that it can send one, the title, because it's a 1,000-year plus trauma inflicted on the Jewish people.
and that can send people into, okay, we need the security of our own homeland no matter what, right? That has got to be first principle, okay? And yeah, Palestinians, sorry for your luck, you know, but that's it.
Yes.
Or to the sense of a real moral sense of, after what's been done to us, we must not do the worst thing we could do would become the oppressor, okay? And Jewish people feel most strongly about this sometimes, you know. Yeah,
I think, you know, you would think perhaps dispassionately that the Jews, after what they went through under fascism, under Hitler, of all peoples, would have an empathy for the human rights of everybody. But it hasn't worked out that way, not at least in modern Israeli politics. And it's almost as if perhaps an analogy might be that, you know, it's often said that people who've undergone child abuse will grow up to be abusers themselves. And I think on one level that explains that, you know, the Israelis have been through this terrible situation in Germany, in Europe, where, you know, millions were wiped out. But it's given them that, and I'm generalizing here, but it's given them a hardness and an unwillingness to see where such abuse is happening to other peoples.
And I think it's a factor that we have it almost mythically in the West, in our cinema and such, that when people are set free from the confines of slavery or whatever, that they become really nice people and well integrated in society. When people who are set free from slavery are deeply traumatized, you know, and act accordingly. So it's not the kind of fairy tale ending when the situation is put right on a political level.
It can be on an individual level, you know. Some people can, you know, and, you know, you think of Mandela, you know, locked up in prison and oppressed for decades, but then coming out not with a desire to oppress, you know, his oppressors, but to think, okay, let's see what can be done here, and to take steps to reconciliation, but on a political level too.
On a political level, but at the same time, South Africa has a lot of problems now from this. And there's actually there's a line near the end of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was in the concentration camp, and he was Jewish, and him and a friend are walking across the field, and his friend is trampling on the crops. I think it must be in Germany, and Viktor Frankl says to him, "What are you doing?" You know, and he says, "Well, it doesn't matter compared to what we've been through." And says, Viktor Frankl probably is, "No, you don't. You see, it matters all the more that we know. They can send you in those directions." So, coming back then to back on the Isle of Man, and it's a requirement of the program that you do presentations.
Yes, very much so, and the Quakers see that as just as important. And you know, we are contractually obliged to do 10 public speaking talks. You heard one of them, you know, when we get back.
Yes. So this is 2 times that you've returned to the Isle of Man and tried to report on foreign parts. Okay, you were talking about Africa before. And there you encounter perhaps a sense of apathy. I don't know, I'm sure there are people who are very interested, but there's a sense of trying to get people interested. With the Middle East, maybe that's there too, but I'm going to guess what's different to Africa is there are people who are anything but apathetic, and maybe not in a healthy way, where you encounter, well, I would definitely think you're going to encounter very pro-Zionist positions, particularly coming from the church, who would be very critical. I don't know if you found very strongly pro-Palestinian positions difficult to deal with also. I'm also thinking that you put on a public talk and you probably have these people in the same room, right? And I saw your talk a couple of times, and I do recall there being some conflict between the audience on both occasions. I think I was involved in one, I was to my discredit, and we all had a chat in the car park afterwards, and it was quite reconciliatory. But on both occasions, I remember people having very strong feelings and a very different story, a very different narrative about what happened there, you know. So go on. So how did you cope with that?
Yes, I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been such a slow burner for for 50 years. I'm old enough to remember the Six-Day War, and as you say, it goes back beyond that. So a lot of people have quite polarized sometimes attitudes to it, and based on their own background and experience, of course. And we are trained in a way to listen to those and to respect them. And every time we do a talk, it's important to put time aside, more time in a way than I can do a half-hour presentation, but to put more time aside to get the views and to have a discussion afterwards. And that's always very important. So yes, I addressed different groups when I came back. Certainly church and Christian groups across a broad spectrum, but also I went to Douglas Mosque. I went to other secular groups, the Round Table, golf clubs, and anyone who would have me. So it was always important and interesting to me to hear what the views of others. And there were sometimes quite polarized views coming forward, not least within the church, as you say. There are many people, not just Jewish but also Christians, who believe that the restoration of the State of Israel in 1948 was something that was foretold as prophecy and in the book of Revelation. And they can point to the book of Leviticus, where God gives Israel all the land between the Nile and the Euphrates, and a literal reading of these will be problematic.
An interesting point too. Zionism is probably predominantly a Christian movement now in terms of numbers, I would guess. 30 million Americans.
Possibly, yeah. Whether they call themselves Zionists, I don't know, but possibly. And the church in the States is particularly influential on the powers that be out there now. Perhaps even more so than the Jewish community within the States. So that was, but it was good to hear those views. And all I can do is hear and say I understand, but say, well, that's not my interpretation of those passages, and to put my view on the record as well. But again, as when you're out there, there's it's counterproductive to show anger during such discussions. You have to listen to each other, and it's no good trying to go out there and be an example of peaceful coexistence when you come back and you have a row with someone in a church hall. And one of the greatest challenges out there was not the work we were doing, I've been described as a day-to-day basis, but also you had 5 of us, ecumenical accompaniers, strangers to each other, living within a house together. So there were 5 of us in East Jerusalem, aged from 23 to 73, all from different nationalities. We had to get on. No one was appointed leader. There was no manager to supervise us. We had to get on. We had to work out rotas. We had to divide up the who would be doing what each week, each day. We had to decide who was going to buy the groceries, who was going to do cooking, who was going to wash up. And in a way, for some people, that's the greatest challenge of all. But it's valid, because unless we can actually rub along together and show give and take in a purely domestic setting, what hope is there that we can be witnesses in an international one?
It's a powerful point.
Good point to finish on, maybe.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone. Please do subscribe for more interviews like this, and I always welcome feedback on any of the platforms. Thank you.